Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Let's go to voting, elections, and corruption, a brief Charlottesville history. I'm going to have to start with relatively recent history because I've only been in the Charlottesville area about 20 years. I've done a lot of research and I have a lot of information to share with you today, and I think it's important for this information to be continued, to be passed down, because a lot of people are Johnny-come-latelys and don't know what's happened here in Charlottesville. First, I want to dispel a few myths as we get into the topic of voting, elections, and corruption. The first one is that people are basically honest and we can trust them. If you believe that, actually, it's very sad because people will take advantage of you. People will take advantage of elections. People will take advantage of opportunities to gain and gain power, and they do that all the time. We need to be aware that people are not basically honest. Oh, here's another one. There is no documented voter fraud. Well, first of all, voter fraud is difficult to ascertain, and it's also difficult to prosecute, and a lot of times there's evidence of it, and yet it's not prosecuted for various reasons. But there is documented voter fraud. There is documented voter fraud right here in Charlottesville. We'll get to some of the problems a little bit later on in our discussion. The system can't be hacked or gamed. Anybody who believes that, again, is woefully ignorant. And the further we go into electronics, it also opens up a whole new frontier of opportunities to hack or game the system. Republicans are trying to suppress the vote by having rules for voting. Now, we've heard that a lot coming from Democrats. I even debated somebody on Newsmax TV on the topic, and it's really laughable, except that many people buy into this premise of attempted Republican vote suppression. In 2019, there was a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research demonstrating that voter ID laws have no measurable impact on voting behavior. In other words, that Republicans are not suppressing the vote by instituting voter ID laws. No measurable impact. And that's on top of a study by Heritage Foundation in 2007 that found essentially the same thing. Now let's go to Charlottesville. There is a history here of vote buying. And when I started digging into all of this and talking to people behind the scenes, I found out that prior to my political tenure here in 2002 to 2006 on the Charlottesville City Council, and maybe overlapping my political tenure, there was a lot of payments going on. Especially pastors were being bought off in this community. Things like roofs being fixed and other sorts of favoritism, political patronage, maybe appointments to school boards and things like that. But the Democrat Party of Charlottesville had a lot of funny stuff going on in the background and sometimes out in the open. This was a Democrat town, still is, but was a heavy Democrat machine town at the time. And it was just open knowledge that we're very good to our pastors here, particularly in the black churches. We'll keep them coming back to the voting booth time and time again. I had an interesting discovery as well during my own electoral tenure that the Charlottesville Fire Department was working to elect Democrats over the years. I walked one day into a local Staples store to pick up some election materials when I was running for re-election, and found out from an employee of Staples who was speaking to me off the record that members of the Charlottesville Fire Department were working in coordination with the Charlottesville Democrat Party and putting together a dossier of opposition research on me. How interesting. Well, I guess they found that affiliation and supporting Democrats was a very mutually beneficial relationship, as the Charlottesville Fire Department was favored over the Charlottesville Police Department for many, many years in this community, and it may still be the case in getting things like new buildings or resources, equipment, and so forth. And then, of course, there were the stories of sandwiches and walking around money paid out by local Democrats, cigarettes, all the things you've heard of over the years in order to buy votes. That was all going on here in Charlottesville from anecdotal conversations I've had with people over the years, many of them now gone, but trustworthy sources who told me all of these things and confirmed them. You know, I was astounded back in 2005 when we had the elected school board referendum on the ballot. And I didn't really notice this and didn't pay any attention to it, that in Charlottesville, there were not curtains around the voting booth. Yes, I say that again. The votes were not private. You had Democrats working inside of Charlottesville polling places as election officials. These are well-known Democrats in a machine town and watching over the shoulder to make sure everything was going just fine in the voting booth. So let me talk to you briefly about the elected school board because it was a very contentious issue. It was a campaign issue of mine, and a lot of people laughed at me and said it'll never happen in Charlottesville because the city council has to approve it, and they'll never approve it. Or you can put it on the ballot with a certain number of signatures, but that's been tried before and was not successful. What happened when it was tried before? Well, one time there was a prominent Democrat, and she and her husband were working on this, and they got a bunch of signatures to get it on the ballot and turned it into Paul Garrett, who was then the clerk of court in Charlottesville, highly incompetent. We'll get to him a little bit later. But Paul Garrett somehow lost all of those signatures. So when we were putting signatures in and we got our own effort going for the elected school board, I always kept copies and had Paul Garrett sign the copies. But how did all of this happen? How did we get this on the ballot in a place where it was highly unpopular? The Democrats wanted the power to appoint school board members. Now, most of Virginia had changed over at that time in 2005. Charlottesville was a Democrat machine holdout. Well, what happened? We were looking for a new superintendent, and Scotty Griffin was hired for demographic reasons at the behest of then Mayor Maurice Cox, who told the people on the search committee, this is what we would like our new superintendent to look like. Scotty Griffin happened to be a black female. Well, I had a phone call from somebody on the committee, herself a black female, who told me, I think we just made a big mistake in hiring this superintendent. We did it because Maurice Cox told us or hinted very heavily, this is what we should do, and this is what we did. Rob, please help. Well, I couldn't help that person because the decision had already made, and I met Scotty Griffin and I liked her, but she raised a lot of hackles here in Charlottesville almost immediately with programs and proposals that were ruffling the feathers of the white progressives in Charlottesville who didn't want their kids in the same classroom as black kids. Yes, that's the case, and there was a lot of complaining. They never came right out and said it, but it was pretty obvious that's not what they wanted, and that is what Scotty Griffin wanted. So we decided that this was the perfect time to put it on the ballot, that we just may have witnessed a perfect storm in Charlottesville. And of course, it came to be that we had bipartisan support because a prominent Democrat and UVA professor, Jeff Rossman, decided to get on board with the effort. Jeff Rossman and I were at the forefront of this movement for an elected school board. And while Jeff didn't do a whole lot of work outside of just initially putting his name on it and making a few phone calls, we did have a lot of people who happened to be Democrats and also some Republicans helping us gather signatures. We verified the signatures before even turning them into Paul Garrett, and I made sure that he noted every single sheet and every signature that I turned in. We went over the top. Far over the top of what was necessary. It was 10% of the registered voters at the time and got this on the ballot. And we had these little elected school board signs popping up all over Charlottesville. They were purple, they were bold, they were attention-getting, and they simply said, elected school board, yes, with a little box and a check mark in it. Well, duplicitous David Descano, who was then quite influential amongst Charlottesville Democrats, had refused to take a stand on the elected school board. But after seeing all of the purple signs all over Charlottesville, literally just a few days before the election, wetted his finger and stuck it in the air and decided that there were too many purple signs and that he must endorse the elected school board. We also got the endorsement of the Charlottesville NAACP, Dr. Rick Turner and his group, knowing that this was a good idea for Charlottesville. But what about Election Day? There was a lot of discussion about this issue of no curtains around the voting booth, and the Registrar of Voters, Sherry Iachetta, after conversation with many interested parties, decided that 2005, during the elected school board referendum, would probably be a good time to purchase some curtains for the voting booths, which had been naked and open for all of those elections previous, and it finally happened. Something else interesting about the November 8th, 2005 election, in addition to the elected school board, we had probably the most closely contested statewide race in Virginia's history. It was for the Virginia Attorney General, where Republican Bob McDonnell was going against Democrat Cree Deeds. A 360-vote victory when all was said and done. I was then, as I referenced, still in office as a Charlottesville city councilor and was called by the Republican Party of Virginia to check ballot security in Charlottesville. You see, the officials were very concerned that ballots might go missing or other ballots might just mysteriously show up, as has been known to happen in Charlottesville and other Democrat strongholds in Virginia over the years. It's a very convenient discovery when that happens because they always seem to favor Democrats. So I had to go down to the Charlottesville Clerk of Court's office. This was then Paul Garrett, a beneficiary of political patronage in Charlottesville, one who always said, "Hey, I'm black, vote for Democrats, be just like me," and look, they gave me a job, which they did, and he held it many years, rumored to be thoroughly incompetent, horrible at customer service, rude to customers, and running a slipshod operation at the Charlottesville Clerk of Court. So I went down there one day. I think I was unannounced. I didn't tell Paul Garrett because I didn't want him to know I was coming. I came with a camera in hand and said, "Hey, Paul, I'm here on behalf of the Republican Party of Virginia, and I'd like to take a look at the ballot security." Now, the ballots were to be in a locked container inside of a locked area. This is very important. What I found, first of all, was a very nervous Paul Garrett who was smiling at me, obviously scared and intimidated by my visit because of what I was about to find. So he didn't really let on verbally that anything was wrong, and he said, "Okay, let me take you over to the ballots." And here's what I found. The ballots were being kept in what appeared to be a janitorial closet that was not locked. Paul didn't use a key to open the closet. And when I went inside, I saw this box. It was a little wooden box, and it had a little latch on the front of it. Sticking out from the box on the top and over the sides were what appeared to be paper ballots, just sticking out. Either they had been pulled out and reviewed or they had been stuck in there after the fact. It was the strangest sight I'd ever seen. And I took pictures of that, documented it, and sent those pictures to the Republican Party of Virginia just for their information. Over the years, there have been boxes of ballots found in car trunks and things missing from the registrar's office, information breached, a laptop gone here and there. All of these things happening in Charlottesville under the leadership of then Registrar Sherry Iachetta. Now, I talked about Sherry Iachetta and her putting curtains up in 2005. That was a very good thing. But in 2015, it turned out that Sherry Iachetta had been engaged in funny business inside the registrar's office, unauthorized use of cell phones and other things, and charged with felonies along with other people inside that office. Sherry Iachetta pled guilty to 4 misdemeanors and was removed from office. However, a corrupt electoral board in Charlottesville refused to indict her, instead acting as a wall of protection during all of this corruption and all of this trouble going on. And yet today, with all of these things that have happened in Charlottesville and things like this that have happened across Virginia and across the country, we are proposing to remove safeguards from the system. We want to go to a mail-in voting system where we've seen multiple instances across the country very recently of ballots being mailed out to people who are long since dead or have long since moved. Oh, what's going to happen to those ballots? Well, maybe they'll be sold. Maybe they'll just be voted by somebody else as a proxy vote, and there's really no way to stop that. We have early voting, which is a horrible idea because, well, a candidate could die or information could come out before the election after you've already cast your vote. Oh, too late. Sorry. And of course, we have the removal of the photo ID requirements by Democrats in Virginia, which will lead to a lot of problems here with our votes, a lot of corruption. And when I think about no photo ID for voting, one of our most sacred institutions in the United States of America and on the local and state levels, no photo ID. You can walk up and say you're somebody, and if no one says anything different, you can cast a vote for them. But where do you need photo ID? Well, if you want to buy alcohol, you need photo ID. Why? Because they want to make sure the person is qualified by age to purchase alcohol. The same thing buying cigarettes. How about opening a bank account? We don't want any bank fraud. We need your photo ID. In fact, the other day I was asked for a photo ID to deposit money into my own bank account. What about when you're applying for food stamps or welfare? May I see your photo ID, please? We don't want any more fraud than already exists in the system, and so we're going to mitigate that with photo ID. When you go to work for somebody, they want to know who you are. Photo ID. When you're buying a house or a car, they want to know who you are. Photo ID. Getting on a plane, you better have a photo ID or you're not getting on the plane. Getting married, we want to know who's getting married in this place, so please provide us with a photo ID, husband and wife. When you're adopting a pet, my goodness, pets are very important. We want to make sure that we know who's taking these pets so that if there's any nefarious purpose, we can track them down. How about buying a gun? Your Second Amendment God-given right. Photo ID, please. We want to know who you are. You're donating blood? What if there's a problem? Photo ID. Happens to be a disease. We want to be able to track it back to you. Photo ID. And even at the NAACP National Convention, those who were claiming photo ID was racist for voting insisted on photo ID for entry into their event. We are a community, a state, a nation truly gone off our rocker. And I think this upcoming election will bear me out. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Support this podcast online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with Dr. Clara Belle Wheeler, a former member of the Virginia State Board of Elections, a longtime elections integrity advocate, and today we're talking about election security and mail-out voting. And Clara Belle, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Thank you, Rob, and I love the name of your new program, Unleashed. Yeah. That's exactly what we need to be.
It certainly is. I want to start out by talking about our unique situation. So you've been involved in elections for a long time, both at the state level and the local level, and just keeping an eye on things. And yet we're in a situation that we haven't really faced before. Have there been any precedents set for something like this in the past?
Not really. I mean, the closest you can come is the 2008 presidential election, when we had, at that point, unprecedented numbers of people voting. And we want people to vote, no doubt about it. If you're a citizen of the United States and you're informed, you should be voting and speaking your mind. But we've never had anything like the attempt to, if you will, game the system by having an all mail-out balloting process when you don't really know that the election rolls you're using for your mail-outs are valid. And that's, I think, one of the main problems with all mail-out. You can't depend on the validity of the registered voter lists. because they're not accurate.
I appreciate, first of all, that you qualified the whole issue of voting, that people really need to be informed. You know, I've never been more disturbed than standing out at the polls working over the years for certain candidates, and people walked up and really many of them had no idea who was running or what the issues were on the ballot, and they were just doing what someone else told them to do. So I want to give you a double exclamation point and a bravo for saying, hey, people need to get yourself informed.
You do need to be informed, and that's the problem that we have with another problem with the all mail-out ballots. They all go out in a big tranche, which overwhelms the registrars, to be sure, but people are voting 45 days before the election, and information comes to light. I mean, that's what opposition research is all about. You're trying to find out what's going on with the candidates, and you put it out there in the public space. If somebody's already voted, they can't change their mind.
It would be very troubling to me to vote early for the exact reason you specify. And Clara Belle, you know, they have something called October surprise, or they used to. I wonder if that term will be going away now, and maybe it will be a July surprise if we're opening, balloting up 30, 60, 90 days in advance of the election. It just seems like a colossally bad idea to me.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely. You need to be informed, and you need to keep abreast of whatever information is coming out. And it may not come to the public purview until the week before the election or the night before the election, but certainly not 45 days, which is when our early absentee voting starts, or early in-person absentee voting starts in Virginia, which is September the 18th this year. A lot of information can come out. We're only, the Democrats are in the middle of their convention, and they've just named the vice presidential candidate. That's just the top of the ticket. You've still got congressional races going on that information is coming out about candidates and what they think. I mean, you need to know what your candidate is going to do if they're elected before you vote for them.
It's certainly the case. And so I want to understand what the proposal is here in Virginia. What are we proposing to do, and who has the authority to make such a proposal?
That's probably one of the most important questions we can ask as voters. The General Assembly special session is meeting today. There are not any advertised election changes, but who knows what will pop up as the delegates and senators are seated today. Right now, there were 63 or more election bills changing the way the elections take place, passed and signed in the most recent General Assembly session. 63 different changes. Registrars and electoral boards are trying to get those in process, and they're not easy. For instance, you can go into a registrar's office and vote in-person absentee without any excuse, according to the new law. You just walk in and say, I'm here, I want to vote.
Is this just early voting? Is that another name for early voting now with those no excuse?
It's another name for early voting.
Okay.
Yes. The more technically correct is in-person absentee voting, meaning you go into the registrar's office and vote early. And you mark your ballot and you put it in the optical scan machine, and it's cast. It's gone. It's there. It cannot be changed. Okay. The other is there are lots other choice for early absentee voting is to request in writing that the registrar sends you an absentee ballot. That means the registrar checks the voter registration rolls for his or her county or city and sends you an absentee ballot. You mark it, you put it back in the United States Postal Service, and it comes back to the registrar. And how they handle those is an issue we can discuss. The third choice is many large communities such as Fairfax, Chesterfield, Prince William, a lot of large localities have satellite offices. These are offices that are technically satellite offices of the registrar's office. They are connected to VERIS, the Virginia system for processing all registration records and voting records, meaning if you go into a satellite office and you vote, an early absentee ballot 45 days before an election or whenever the locality opens its satellite offices. And there are no hard and fast code-driven rules of when satellites open. Do they open 45 days before? Do they open 2 weeks before? Or anywhere in between? You can go in, and then that office is supposed to check when you come in to vote that you have not already voted somewhere else in the locality where you're registered to vote. Remembering that those satellite offices can accept anyone who is registered to vote in that locality. Fairfax has, I'm not sure if Fairfax knows. Fairfax actually probably does know how many satellite offices they have, but the rest of us don't. 15, 20, who knows? Because it's a huge jurisdiction. So that satellite office must be able to produce a ballot for everyone who lives in Fairfax County. And they have a lot of House of Delegates. They have multiple congressional races. They have lots of issues on their ballots. So if you go into the satellite office and vote, you must be given the ballot that is germane or correct for you voting in that satellite office. Plus, that satellite office has to notify Verus that you have voted, and therefore, if you go into a different satellite office, you can't vote because you've already voted. Electronically, that's hard to do securely. We know about hacking. We know that our Verus system has not been hacked. But the minute you start putting out multiple sites that are connected to Verus, you're worried that there could be a hack. You're worried that someone's vote, the ballot will go into the optical scan. It's counted. You just want to make sure that that person or that name doesn't go somewhere else and vote.
This is such a can of worms. We're talking with Dr. Clara Belle Wheeler about election security and the problems of mail-out voting. I saw on my Facebook feed, a friend of mine from California put up a picture of a household in his proximity that received multiple ballots in California. People who were no longer living there, some of the people living there got 2 or maybe 3 ballots. And I'm thinking, this is just a recipe for disaster. With all of these ballots going out, aren't we going to have a lot of problems in ascertaining, first of all, are these people even still alive? Do they still live here? And what happens to those other ballots that get sent out to a person who's no longer alive or no longer there?
Well, that's the good question, Rob. We don't have good list maintenance. California is notorious for not doing good list maintenance. Virginia would like to think that we are better at doing that. We use the national death records that go out every couple of months. The last time Virginia sent out to its registrars the death record, meaning these are the names of the people that the Social Security knows have died. And we send them out to Virginia, to Richmond, and Richmond divides them up by counties and cities, and then the counties and cities get the names of the people who have officially died, and then they take them off. The local registrars remove those names because they're dead. The last time that was done was June. It's now almost the end of August, and we're coming up on a November election. Again, absentee voting starts September the 18th. We don't know whether those death records are accurate, and we don't know that everybody's getting them nationwide in a timely fashion. The other way that we check the accuracy of our list of voter-registered people is using the national change of address. We are a very mobile society. Even with the Chinese virus restraints, people are moving. People are fleeing contaminated areas, if you will, and moving into other areas. Every year, under code of the Virginia, the Department of Elections is supposed to supply the local registrars with their names of those people who have changed their address, so that the registrars can notify those people that they have moved, and If they have not moved, they need to notify the registrar. Or if they have moved, they need to notify their new registrar where they are and possibly register in a different location. The Department of Elections has said in writing to certain registrars that the Department of Elections has chosen to not send out the national change of address information until, wait for this, December. Because they're so busy with all of their, quote, COVID responsibilities. Well, maintaining accurate voter registration lists is very important, because if you're going to send out mail-out ballots, and let's stop for a second and define terms.
Mm-hmm.
Absentee voting, mailed absentee ballots require that the voter request of their registrar in writing that an absentee ballot be sent to that voter, wherever that voter wants it sent. If that voter has gone to Alaska to avoid the virus, then their absentee voting ballot will be sent to Alaska. Perfectly legitimate thing to do. You're not going to be living on Park Street in the city of Charlottesville. You have gone to Alaska. That's perfectly legitimate. But you have to be a registered voter in order to have an absentee ballot mailed by the registrar. Okay? That's the system we use in Virginia now. Other states, Massachusetts just announced that they are going to do an all mail-out balloting. That means everyone who is on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts voter registration list will have a ballot mailed to them. You see why we need to have accurate lists, because if you've moved from Massachusetts, died in Massachusetts, you'll get a ballot anyway, and that list may not be correct. Fortunately, we're not doing that in Virginia, but that's what there are people who want to have everyone who has ever registered, who is on a voter registration list, have a mail-out ballot sent to them for this election.
You and I, Clara Belle, have been talking over the years about getting the voter rolls cleaned up. We've talked about efforts and lawsuits in various states to get these names off the rolls, to get the registrars to clean up their rolls. And a lot of people, I think, during that time are like, well, what do you really care about? You know, everything's under control. And yet now we see why you were calling for this over the past many years. And it's really, in some instances, too late to fix the problem within the next couple of months.
Well, you can't change the fix. That's, you can work with what you've got. But for instance, national change of address. Think of the thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people who go to colleges or universities in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And every fall there is a big push to get those students to register where they go to school. They may live in Pennsylvania. They may live in Colorado. They may live who knows where. But they come to school here, so they register to vote in Virginia. Well, now we're in virtual time. We don't know what kind of time we're in educationally. Some of these students may not come back to Virginia. Some of these students may register to vote in Colorado, wherever they live. We don't know because we haven't done the national change of address informational changes for our registrars in Virginia.
I remember a couple of years, maybe going back more than a couple of years ago, talking to some folks who invested a tremendous amount of time in doing some investigation about student voting, double voting in Virginia, and they were very disturbed at what they found out in a very limited investigation. And so it seems to me that if those problems were identified years ago and have never been addressed, they've only gotten worse. People know how to game the system. There was a website a couple years ago telling you, hey, here's where you can choose to cast your vote, where it's going to have the most impact, for college students and people living in a different state. And it really seems like the system is being gamed. So what is it that we are to do looking forward to prevent this sort of gaming of the system, if in fact we were really interested in doing that?
If we were really interested in having accurate registered voters lists in Virginia, We would make sure that we do the National Change of Address update on a regular basis, not just once a year. We would make sure that we're doing the national death rate. We would make sure that when a student moves, graduates, goes to graduate school elsewhere, just doesn't come back to its local Virginia college or university, that they would be given notice that they are no longer eligible to vote in Harrisonburg, in Charlottesville, wherever they're students. If they're no longer residents here, they need to change their voter registration elsewhere. But we're not doing that.
It seems to me there's also a real problem here, and I've seen stories written, Dr. Clara Belle Wheeler, about the potential harvesting and selling of ballots, even at the post office, where unscrupulous people working there or people elsewhere would get a hold of ballots of people who are dead or undeliverable mail and then sell them.
Absolutely, it happens all the time. With this new, it used to be called the Voter Procurement Center. It changes its name with each election, so it's harder to track where they are. But they've sent out recently meaning within the last 2 weeks, and are continuing to do so, pre-populated absentee ballot requests to people, to voters. They know where they are mailing these pre-populated, meaning they have all the voter information on this application. It just needs to be signed. Well, in Virginia, there is no check for the validity of a signature. And registrars will say, we're not handwriting experts. Well, that's true. They're not handwriting experts. But there's no way to check the signature. So they mail out the voter procurement or the voter assistance or voter, whatever they call themselves, center, sends out mass mailings to people to request absentee ballots. Maybe they get sent to the registrars, maybe they don't, depending upon the person who gets them. Sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are cats and dogs. Sometimes they're people who are no longer breathing. Sometimes they're for people who no longer live in Virginia. But if the voter registrar's office has not received written notice that someone has moved or they've died, that voter request, that mailed-in voter request, will be answered and will be sent out, and a ballot will go out. Now, if you live in Albemarle County, for instance, mostly rural, there's probably not somebody going through all of the mailboxes every day to check to see if an absentee ballot's arrived. At least I hope not. It's a federal offense to open a post office box, whether it's a rural route or in a post office. But suppose you live in a huge apartment complex, and there are 600 or 700, 1,000 people in all these little boxes there. It wouldn't take a real stretch of someone's creativity to find out when the absentee ballots are being mailed out, collect the absentee ballots, vote them, and mail them back in. Or have a party at this huge, massive this apartment complex and say, hey, we're having a party in the social room tonight. Come on down, we'll help you fill out your absentee ballot. See the mischief that could be created then.
Well, you certainly can, and I'm looking at a letter exactly as you described, coming from the Center for Voter Information that was addressed to my wife. And one of the interesting things I noticed, Clara Belle, was that the return address, it says Albemarle County Registrar, but then the address that follows that is one of these rent a P.O. box in some little mall, a strip mall around here. It's not the Albemarle County Registrar at all. So it seems to me that the law is being broken here. And I'm wondering, first of all, is that the case? And second of all, what, if anything, is or can be done about it?
Well, the registrars have to be very careful when one of these requests for an absentee ballot comes back to the registrar's office. They have to be careful and check to make sure that the address is a valid registered voter, that the name is, and that they're sending a ballot to somebody that signed it. And unless they're clairvoyant, they may not be able to know who signed that request. The person to whom it's addressed needs to look at where they're sending their request for an absentee ballot and make sure they're sending a request for an absentee ballot to the General Registrar's office, not a no-tell-motel post office box. Because then if the no-tell-motel voter absentee ballot goes to that, then it might be mailed back to a post office box, which is perfectly legitimate. You can have a mailing address that's a post office box, but it better be on record at the General Registrar's office or on your request for an absentee ballot. You must say, I want my absentee ballot mailed to this post office box wherever.
It seems to me we're in for a lot of trouble ahead, and I think it's almost like the Cloward and Piven approach, an attempt to overwhelm and crash our system. We've seen all the discussion about the post office and whether or not they could even handle all of this mail coming through. So where do we go from here, and what could we anticipate leading up to November and the day after the election?
Crystal ball is kind of cloudy. Rob, I think in terms of doing something, we have to let people know. You're doing it with your podcast, with your radio shows. I think we need to contact all of the members of the General Assembly, the members of Congress. We have to talk to our friends. We have to tell people when we go to church, make sure you vote. Make sure you vote in person. Don't be taken in by scams. If you get a request for an absentee ballot in the mail and you didn't ask for one from your registrar, tear it up, throw it away, burn it. Report it to any type of honest place. Report it to your registrar's office. Say, I got an absentee ballot request. I didn't ask for one.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can keep a record if they are. We each have to be responsible and make sure that we're not allowing our ballot to be scammed. There's no reason to not vote in person today in our world. I say frequently the voting public needs to know that polling places are one of the safest places you can be. You control, you have how many people go in, how many people come out. You have safe distancing. Everybody wears a mask in the polling place. You go in, it's a lot cleaner and a lot safer to be in a polling place or a registrar's office to vote in person absentee than it is to be in any big box store, any grocery store, walking down the mall. I mean, there are very few people who have cloistered themselves in their own houses and not stepped out and seen another human being since March. Very few people. So feel safe because you are voting in person at a polling place.
These are words of wisdom from Dr. Clara Belle Wheeler, former member of the Virginia State Board of Elections. Thank you so much for your insights here, and I hope that we will see a clean and fair election come November, but it seems like we're on the road to a lot of troubles.
I agree with you, Rob. You keep putting it out, people keep listening to what you put out, and we'll be a lot better off.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.